She was born among silk and scripture, destined to unite a kingdom at war with itself. But her wedding became a massacre, her marriage a betrayal, and her life an 18-year imprisonment. Marguerite de Valois, the brilliant daughter of Catherine de' Medici, watched France drown in blood and faith. Her crown was a cage, her love a sentence, yet she endured when every throne around her fell. Marguerite de Valois entered the world in 1553, in the palace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a place where gold leaf shimmered on the walls and danger hid behind every smile. She was born into the most brilliant yet most cursed family in France, the House of Valois. Her father, King Henry II, was a warrior of fierce pride, and her mother, Catherine de' Medici, was a woman whose love could suffocate and whose ambition could poison. Between them, Marguerite inherited beauty, intellect, and a destiny tied to blood. From her earliest years, she stood apart. While other girls were taught embroidery and etiquette, Marguerite learned Latin, philosophy, and theology. She read Aristotle and St. Augustine, debated with priests, and quoted poets from memory. Her tutors called her a prodigy, courtiers called her dangerous. For in a court where women were meant to smile and obey, she dared to think, and worse, she dared to speak. Scribes of her time wrote that her beauty was almost supernatural. Her dark hair, her luminous skin, her commanding gaze, all combined with a voice that could silence a room. The chronicler Brantome, who knew her personally, would later write, "She was the most beautiful woman in France and the most intelligent of her age." But Marguerite's beauty was a weapon she never chose to wield. It was her curse, the first reason the court began to whisper her name. The Valois court glittered like no other in Europe, yet beneath its velvet and incense lay decay. The kingdom was bleeding from within. Catholics and Protestants, the Huguenots, waged endless war. And the palace of the Valois was the fragile bridge holding both sides from total collapse. At its center sat Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, a woman who believed that power was best served cold and that her children were pieces on a chessboard meant to preserve the crown. Marguerite, her youngest daughter, was her brightest piece, and perhaps the one she feared most. Catherine loved her daughter, but it was a love twisted by calculation. She adorned Marguerite in jewels, educated her beyond measure, and whispered to her that knowledge was the only armor a woman could wear in a world ruled by men. Yet every gift had a chain. Catherine's affection came with watchful eyes. Every word Marguerite spoke was measured, every smile analyzed. The court of France in the mid-16th century was a labyrinth of alliances, spies, and silent enemies. Even as a child, Marguerite learned that truth was a luxury. To survive, she had to speak in riddles, hide her thoughts behind laughter, and understand that power was a performance. She became fluent not only in Latin and poetry, but also in silence. Her brothers, each in turn, wore the crown. François and Lequesne, frail and doomed. Charles IX, impulsive and haunted. And Henri III, elegant yet cruel. Each one was haunted by the ghosts of civil war, by the blood that Catherine's politics had spilled in the name of unity. Marguerite watched them all, the princes who had everything yet lived in fear of their own mother's designs. In that glittering cage of Versailles and the Louvre, Marguerite learned what it meant to be both adored and disposable. By the time she reached adolescence, suitors from across Europe sought her hand. She was not merely a princess, she was a political prize, a symbol of reconciliation between Catholic and Protestant factions. Catherine de' Medici entertained them all, the Spanish, the Italians, the Austrians. But none would satisfy her vision. For Catherine, marriage was never about love. It was about control. And the man she would choose for Marguerite would ignite one of the darkest chapters in French history. Still, for a brief moment, Marguerite's youth glittered like a dream. The gardens of Saint-Germain echoed with music and poetry. She rode on horseback through the forests, debated philosophy with courtiers, and danced under chandeliers so bright they hid the cracks in the marble floors. She believed, perhaps naively, that intelligence and grace could save her from her family's chaos. She wrote later in her memoirs, "I believed myself born under a star of peace, though I lived in an age of knives." Those words would prove prophetic, for beneath the polished calm of the Valois court, Catherine was already arranging her daughter's future. A marriage meant to unite the kingdom, but destined to tear it apart. Marguerite, brilliant and brave, did not yet see the net tightening around her. Her mother's affection masked calculation. Her brother's smiles hid contempt. The glittering salons where she shone were lit by candles that burned too fast. She was the flower of the Valois dynasty, bright, fragrant, admired by all. But even the most beautiful flower cannot see the shadow of the blade that will cut its stem. And as France's wars of faith deepened, Marguerite's own faith, in love, in loyalty, in family, would be tested in a way no royal education could prepare her for. The same court that raised her would one day devour her. By the late 1560s, France was a nation in ruins. 7 civil wars had torn through its lands, pitting neighbor against neighbor, Catholic against Protestant, brother against brother. Cities burned, churches were desecrated, and the once mighty Valois crown was little more than a fragile emblem trying to hold back the flood. Catherine de' Medici, now the regent in power behind the throne, sought one last desperate solution: marriage. Her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, would be the key. Among all the men who could have been chosen, Catherine's eyes turned toward Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince of Bourbon blood, charismatic, clever, and inconveniently ambitious. He was the opposite of what a French princess should marry. A heretic in the eyes of the church, a rival in the eyes of the crown. But in Catherine's view, the match could bridge the chasm dividing France. It was a political gamble dressed as a wedding. Marguerite, however, was not asked. She had grown up within a family where love was a currency easily traded for power. Rumors swirled that she had been in love with Henry of Guise, a powerful Catholic noble whose family rivaled the Valois in influence. Catherine forbade the union, fearing the Guise clan's growing strength. Some accounts even claim that Catherine discovered her daughter's secret meetings with Guise and punished her with a brutality that left emotional scars for life. When the time came, Marguerite bowed to duty, or rather, to the illusion of it. The summer of 1572 dawned bright, and Paris prepared for a royal wedding that was meant to heal the kingdom's wounds. The streets were decorated with garlands, musicians played, and thousands of Protestant nobles poured into the city to witness the unprecedented union of Catholic princess and Protestant prince. It was the most ambitious act of diplomacy in Catherine's long, calculating career. On August 18, 1572, the bells of Notre Dame rang out as Marguerite, radiant in a gown of white and gold, walked down the aisle. Yet, standing beside her, Henry of Navarre was forbidden to enter the cathedral proper. As a Protestant, he could not take part in a Catholic mass. Their marriage ceremony, awkward and symbolic, was performed on the steps outside. A union literally divided by faith. As she lifted her gaze toward her new husband, Marguerite could not have known that the same bells ringing in celebration would soon toll for the dead. Only 6 days later, before dawn on August 24th, the night of St. Bartholomew began. The city of Paris was already tense. Protestant nobles had gathered to discuss grievances, and Catholic leaders, fearing an uprising, whispered of preemptive strikes. Catherine de' Medici, ever the tactician, met with her son King Charles in private. No one knows exactly what words were spoken, only that, hours later, a bell rang from the tower of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, and hell was unleashed. The massacre began with the assassination of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the Protestant leader and Henry of Navarre's ally. His body was thrown from a window, mutilated by the mob below. The violence spread like wildfire. From alley to alley, from home to home, Catholics hunted Protestants with knives and pikes, shouting, "Kill them all," as blood filled the cobblestones. And in the middle of it all, the bride of peace, trapped in her wedding chamber. Marguerite would later write in her memoirs, with chilling clarity, that she awoke to the sound of screams and banging on her door. Covered in her nightgown, she opened it to see one of her husband's men, wounded and desperate, begging for help. Moments later, soldiers burst in, blades drawn. Thinking quickly, Marguerite threw herself over the dying man and screamed, "You must kill me before you kill him." Her courage and her royal blood stopped them just long enough for Henry's life to be spared. Outside, the Seine turned crimson. Thousands of Protestants were slaughtered, their corpses thrown into the river. The massacre spread beyond Paris, to towns and villages across France. What began as a political marriage became the bloodiest wedding in European history. Henry of Navarre, realizing his survival depended on submission, renounced his faith and converted to Catholicism. Marguerite stood beside him, silent and hollow-eyed, as the court rejoiced over his conversion. In truth, both bride and groom had been reduced to pawns, one by politics, the other by survival. Within weeks, the promise of peace had dissolved into horror. The Protestant world saw the Valois crown as treacherous, while Catholics distrusted Henry's forced conversion. Marguerite's position was untenable. She was hated by both factions, seen either as a heretic's wife or a traitor's daughter. In the years that followed, their marriage became a theater of absence. Henry and Marguerite lived separate lives, their bond defined only by political utility. He pursued mistresses and military campaigns. She retreated into books, poetry, and reflection. Yet, even through betrayal, Marguerite remained loyal to the idea of France. A France that no longer existed outside her memories. She had been crowned with roses and wedded in gold, but her veil had hidden the scent of blood. Her first act as a queen had been to save lives while others took them. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre would haunt her forever. It marked the end of her innocence, the death of her family's honor, and the beginning of her long descent into exile and suspicion. France had tried to unite itself through her body, her name, and her vows, and failed. From that day onward, Marguerite de Valois was no longer merely a daughter of kings. She became the living emblem of a kingdom devouring itself. The blood of St. Bartholomew's Day had barely dried when the marriage that was meant to save France began to decay. Henry of Navarre, Marguerite's husband, once a Protestant hero and now a reluctant Catholic, had survived by renouncing his faith. But survival had a price. He was neither trusted by his new Catholic allies nor forgiven by his Protestant followers. He belonged nowhere, and Marguerite soon discovered that she too had married into that same exile of the soul. The young couple, barely out of their 20s, lived under the watchful eye of the court, a gilded cage where every glance was political and every silence dangerous. To the Catholics, Marguerite was the daughter of Catherine de' Medici, the architect of the massacre that had slaughtered thousands of Protestants. To the Huguenots, she was the sister of tyrants, a royal pawn draped in silk and deceit. The two faiths, once promised peace through her union, now used her as proof that reconciliation was impossible. And between those two worlds stood Henry of Navarre, pragmatic, ambitious, and emotionally distant. He was a man of charm, known for his humor and cunning, but also for his hunger for power and pleasure. In the months following the massacre, he quickly resumed his secret alliances with Protestant nobles, even as he continued to attend Catholic Mass under his mother-in-law's gaze. Marguerite, raised in a world of control and appearances, recognized the strategy. The same double game her mother had played all her life. But where Catherine used deception as armor, Henry used it as a ladder. For Marguerite, it was the beginning of a different kind of imprisonment. She was the wife of a man who shared neither her bed nor her heart. Henry's affairs became the scandal of every corridor. The Duchess of Condé, Charlotte de Sauve, and others whispered about in the salons. At first, Marguerite tried to maintain her dignity, masking her humiliation behind her education and wit. But court gossip is more cruel than truth. Rumors spread that she too took lovers. Her letters and gestures were twisted into evidence of treachery. Whether true or not, those stories would one day be used to justify her downfall. Her own mother began to doubt her. Catherine de' Medici, who had married Marguerite for political peace, now feared her daughter's intelligence could ignite another war. To Catherine, Marguerite was dangerous, too independent, too eloquent, too unafraid. The Queen Mother had spent her life surrounding herself with obedient instruments. Marguerite, brilliant and defiant, would not play the tune. In her memoirs, Marguerite later wrote, "At court, love is not a virtue, it is a weapon. It wounds the one who holds it." Those words were not poetry, they were confession. By 1574, King Charles Nutter was dead, poisoned by his own body and guilt. Her brother Henri III ascended the throne, a man of grace and excess, more devoted to artifice than to duty. With him came a new wave of suspicion and betrayal. Henri III had always been wary of his sister's charisma. He accused her of conspiring with enemies, of manipulating her husband for political gain, of desiring influence no woman should possess. Marguerite's position became impossible. Between a husband who mistrusted her and a brother who feared her, she was trapped in a triangle that no diplomacy could resolve. The woman once celebrated as the flower of the Valois was now surrounded by thorns. The final rupture came when her husband, Henry of Navarre, fled Paris under the guise of returning to his estates in the south. Once out of the city, he renounced Catholicism and rejoined the Protestant cause. His escape was a political earthquake, and Marguerite was left behind to face the fury. Catherine accused her of complicity, Henri III of treason. Guards searched her chambers, her letters were seized, her friends interrogated. The court that once adored her turned cold. Marguerite's jewels were confiscated, her servants replaced, her movements restricted. She had become, in all but name, a prisoner of the Louvre. Still, she refused to yield. Even as her world narrowed, Marguerite clung to the only power left to her, her intellect. She wrote letters to both camps, Catholic and Protestant, urging peace, though each side twisted her words into propaganda. Her courage and defiance became legend among those who admired her spirit. But admiration was a double-edged sword in France. It was safer to be silent than to inspire loyalty. Henry of Navarre, far from Paris, continued to wage war and win allies. He became a symbol of resistance against the Valois crown. Yet he did not send for his wife. Their marriage existed now only on parchment, a political relic neither could afford to destroy. Marguerite, meanwhile, was left in the shadow of a faithless husband and a paranoid brother. There were whispers that she might seize power herself, that she, like her mother, would raise an army and claim her own destiny. Those whispers reached Henri III, who feared that his sister might ally with her husband's enemies. In the eyes of the crown, a woman's intelligence was more dangerous than any sword. And so the flower of the Valois found herself wilting, not by time, but by isolation. She once wrote, "I learned that love is a stranger who passes through the gates of the heart and leaves them forever unguarded." It was both an elegy and a warning. Marguerite de Valois had become a wife without a husband, a queen without a court, and a believer in nothing but her own endurance. Her beauty, once her armor, now drew suspicion. Her words, once her strength, now drew spies. France had no place for a woman who refused to kneel, not to a king, not to a husband, not even to history. And soon, that defiance would cost her everything. The Louvre, that glittering palace of kings, was in truth a battlefield disguised in marble. Every candlelit hallway hid spies. Every painted ceiling looked down on conspiracies whispered between silk and steel. For Marguerite de Valois, it was no longer a home. It was a labyrinth designed to break her spirit. Her mother, Catherine de' Medici, still ruled France in all but name, her influence threading through ministers, bishops, and assassins alike. Her brother, King Henri III, wore the crown, but not the courage. He was fragile, a ruler trapped between decadence and dread. His courtiers followed fashion more than faith. His favorites paraded through the palace in pearls and perfumes, while the kingdom outside drowned in civil war and famine. Within this fragile court, rumors were sharper than swords. And Marguerite, beautiful, clever, politically stranded, became the perfect target. She was accused of everything: adultery, conspiracy, witchcraft. Her every letter was intercepted, her servants bribed, her friends exiled. The woman once called the Jewel of France was now named the Serpent of Usson, though she had not yet seen that fortress, which would later be her prison. The gossip began innocently enough. Courtiers whispered that Marguerite had taken lovers, that her intellect was a mask for seduction, that her wit was merely venom. Some accused her of manipulating noblemen to undermine the king. Others claimed she exchanged secret messages with Protestant rebels, or worse, with her estranged husband, Henry of Navarre. In truth, Marguerite's only crime was survival. She had learned, as every royal woman did, that to live was to perform. She wore masks of grace and charm, not because she wished to deceive, but because sincerity was fatal. Her beauty gave her visibility. Her intelligence gave her enemies. She was expected to be silent, yet condemned for secrecy. Every smile was scrutinized, every sigh interpreted as treason. Marguerite understood the irony. In a court drowning in lies, her honesty was the one thing no one believed. King Henry III, consumed by paranoia, surrounded himself with favorites, the mignons, young noblemen whose devotion was theatrical and whose loyalty was purchased. They detested Marguerite for her independence. To them, she was an anachronism, a woman who refused to beg for favor, who spoke of politics as if she had the right to shape it. When Henri III heard that Marguerite was corresponding with her husband's allies in the south, he exploded. She would rather be Queen of Navarre than Sister of France, he raged. Catherine, ever the mediator, tried to soothe him, but in truth, the Queen Mother's patience had also grown thin. For years, Catherine had used her daughter as a pawn of reconciliation. Now that peace had failed, Marguerite was an inconvenience. She was too independent to control, too royal to discard, too visible to silence. And so the court turned its back. Isolated, she began to keep company with poets, philosophers, and soldiers, the kind of men who admired her mind and did not fear her rank. Among them were Henri de Guise, Bussy d'Amboise, and others whose friendship to Marguerite would later be branded as sin. In her memoirs, she wrote of that time with melancholy clarity. They had made my heart a battlefield. Every affection was a crime. Every kindness a plot. Her words were not self-pity, they were diagnosis. The court was poisoned, and everyone who breathed its air slowly suffocated. Plots multiplied like shadows. Nobles rebelled in the provinces. The Guise family, powerful and ambitious, challenged the authority of the crown. In this chaos, Henri III saw conspirators everywhere, including his own sister. When the Duke of Guise was assassinated in 1588 on the king's orders, suspicion immediately fell upon Marguerite. Had she known? Had she warned him? Did she mourn him? No one asked what she truly felt. They only demanded an enemy, and she fit the role too perfectly. To silence her, Henri III confined her to her apartments. Guards were placed at her doors. Letters from friends never reached her. Her jewelry and books were seized, her attendants replaced by spies loyal to the crown. The princess who had once danced beneath chandeliers now spent her nights in near darkness. The sound of footsteps outside her chamber reminding her that she was no longer trusted, not even as a sister. Catherine de Medici visited her occasionally, veiled and cold, speaking not as a mother, but as a monarch. "You have inherited my spirit," she said once, "but not my discipline." To Marguerite, those words were not praise. They were a curse. It was then she realized that she stood utterly alone. Her mother feared her. Her brother despised her. Her husband had abandoned her. But if power had made her enemies, silence would become her armor. Marguerite turned inward, to reading, to writing, to prayer. She studied the Stoics, found comfort in their endurance. If the court would poison her name, she would preserve her mind. She wrote quietly, "In this place where truth is exile, I will build my kingdom of thought." That resolve would soon be tested beyond imagination. For even as she found solace in solitude, the storm outside gathered strength. Henry of Navarre, her estranged husband, was preparing open war against the crown. Her brother's reign was collapsing under rebellion and blood. France was about to implode. And when it did, every rumor and resentment sown against her would come to harvest. The glittering cage of the Valois would shatter, and Marguerite, the woman once called the most dangerous in France, would learn that true danger was not in rebellion, but in survival. By the mid-1580s, France had become a nation eating itself alive. Every province was torn between Catholic League and Protestant rebel, between loyalty to the crown and loyalty to God. The royal bloodline, once the spine of the nation, had fractured into rival veins, and at their heart stood one woman whose name still carried the weight of both factions: Marguerite de Valois. To the Catholics, she was the king's sister, unpredictable, ambitious, and suspect. To the Protestants, she was the estranged wife of their champion, Henry of Navarre. To both, she was dangerous. And to herself, she was simply trapped between the love that had betrayed her and the family that had forsaken her. King Henri III's paranoia had ripened into cruelty. Surrounded by sycophants and spies, he ruled less as a monarch and more as a man haunted by ghosts, his mother's shadow, his murdered enemies, his own insecurities. Each rumor of rebellion fed his fear, and Marguerite's name, whispered too often in the same breath as the rebels of the South, made her an easy scapegoat. When news came that her husband had once again taken up arms in the Southwest, Henri III's fury erupted. He accused Marguerite of secretly aiding Henry of Navarre, of sending letters, gold, and promises. Whether the accusations were true or not hardly mattered. In politics, guilt was never about truth. But Marguerite, cornered and defiant, did not plead. Instead, she did something no Valois woman had ever dared. She raised her own banner. From her estates in Agen, she gathered soldiers loyal to her name and formed her own small army, not in the name of her husband, not of her brother, but of herself. For the first time, she refused to be anyone's pawn. Her troops were few, her allies uncertain, but her spirit was unbroken. In her letters from this period, she wrote, "If they have stripped me of my crown, they shall not strip me of my courage." Her rebellion was not against a throne, but against the suffocation of her existence. She demanded recognition as an independent sovereign, a woman capable of ruling her own lands and her own fate. For a brief moment, she was free, her own mistress in a France collapsing under male ambition. But freedom in that age was short-lived, especially for a woman who dared to grasp it. King Henri III declared her an enemy of the crown. Troops were sent to subdue her, led by men who once called her friend. The citizens of Agen, terrified of retribution, turned on her. The gates she had fortified were thrown open in betrayal. Marguerite fled through the countryside, disguised in peasant's clothes, as royal soldiers ransacked her home. It was a humiliation that might have destroyed another woman, but not her. She fled to Auvergne, to the ancient fortress of Usson, perched high on a volcanic hill in central France. It was cold, remote, and isolated, the kind of place where the world forgets you. There, the king's soldiers finally caught up with her. But rather than drag her back to Paris in chains, Henri III decided on a subtler punishment. He ordered her to remain confined within Usson's walls, indefinitely. It was, effectively, a living tomb. 18 years, that was the sentence. Marguerite, 33 years old and still radiant, entered her fortress with neither ceremony nor trial. Her possessions were stripped, her letters censored, her servants dismissed. Only a few loyal attendants followed her into exile, the last remnants of her past life. Outside, France continued to tear itself apart. Her brother's enemies multiplied, her husband's armies grew stronger. The wars of religion raged on without end, as if every drop of royal blood spilled only demanded more. And yet, within the stone walls of Usson, there was silence. At first, Marguerite fought against it. She demanded justice, wrote letters to the court, appealed to ambassadors. None answered. Weeks turned to months, months to years. Paris forgot her. The Valois name began to fade from the chronicles of power, replaced by the Bourbons and their rising fortunes. And so, she adapted. If she could not command armies, she would command her mind. She built a small library, filled it with the works of Plato, Montaigne, and the scriptures. She turned her confinement into a monastery of thought. Her guards called her La Reine Philosophe, the philosopher queen. Her letters from this time reveal a voice no longer seeking vengeance, but understanding. She wrote, "They have taken from me the world, but not the sky. From my window I see the same stars that shone over my birth. They belong to no king." As the years unfolded, Usson ceased to be her prison and became her kingdom. She tended gardens, held debates with visiting scholars, wrote poetry that blended faith with irony. The woman once accused of sin became a patron of contemplation. Yet the world she had left behind could not stay quiet forever. In 1589, Henri III was assassinated, the last male of the Valois line. Her husband, Henry of Navarre, now stood as heir to the French throne. When Marguerite heard the news, she wept not from joy or bitterness, but from the weight of irony. The man she had married in blood, the heretic she had once saved from death, was now king of the country that had imprisoned her. France would soon crown him Henry IV. But in his triumph, there was no place for her. Her marriage had been reduced to a diplomatic inconvenience, a chain he would later need to break. For Marguerite, the news confirmed what she had long known. Power does not remember its debts, only its advantages. Still, she remained in Uson, surrounded by silence and her books, her heart tempered by solitude. The wars had taken her youth, her family, her throne, but not her voice. And in that mountain fortress, forgotten by the world, she began to write. The castle of Uson stood like a stone sentinel above the valley of Auvergne, remote, windswept, and almost unreachable. For most, it was a place of exile. For Marguerite de Valois, it was a mirror of her own fate. Beautiful from a distance, desolate up close. The year was 1586 when she arrived. A queen without a crown, a wife without a husband, and a daughter without a home. Her brother Henri III had condemned her to remain there for as long as God wills, which, in the language of monarchs, meant forever. Yet Marguerite was not the kind of woman to die quietly in a cell. At first, the fortress was a cruel joke of solitude. The thick volcanic stones swallowed sound, the air smelled of iron and rain. She slept under tapestries that belonged to another age, in rooms so cold that her breath lingered in the air like ghosts. The guards, chosen for loyalty rather than kindness, treated her with distant reverence. She was royal blood, but royal blood under lock and key. In those first months, Marguerite mourned everything she had lost. Her youth, her freedom, her name. She had been born amid music and ceremony, raised to believe that the world turned on the axis of her family's power. Now, she was an afterthought, sealed away in the heart of France while men wrote her destiny in Paris. But isolation, like fire, has two tempers. It can destroy or it can purify. Marguerite chose the latter. Slowly, the rhythms of captivity began to change her. She filled her empty hours not with despair, but with discipline. She ordered her small household to maintain the rituals of court life, meals at set hours, prayer before dawn, and daily readings from scripture or classical philosophy. She insisted that the dignity of the Valois name would not be buried behind stone. "If the court will not remember us," she told her attendants, "then we shall remember ourselves." She wrote endlessly. Letters, essays, verses, fragments of thought that later scholars would recognize as some of the first writings of a modern French woman. She analyzed power, love, virtue, and hypocrisy with a sharpness that came only from betrayal. Her pen became her voice, her defiance, her survival. In one passage she wrote, "They have imprisoned my body, but my thoughts have taken wing." Books became her companions. She read Seneca and Montaigne, translated Psalms, debated theology with passing priests who dared visit her. But beyond philosophy, she turned inward, writing about forgiveness, Faust, about human folly, about the nature of endurance. These writings were not revenge, they were resurrection. Outside her fortress, France continued to tear itself apart. Henri III had been murdered by a fanatic. Her estranged husband, Henry of Navarre, now claimed the throne as Henry IV. The wars of religion raged on, cities burned, and alliances shifted like sand. Messengers occasionally reached Usson with scraps of news: a battle won, a duke executed, a peace treaty broken before the ink had dried. Marguerite read every report with detachment. The world that had banished her was devouring itself exactly as she had foreseen. In one of her letters, she wrote, "Men have built their kingdom on blood and then wondered why their walls weep." Yet even as the outside world decayed, Usson became something unexpected, a sanctuary. Within its stone walls, Marguerite created a miniature court of her own, one ruled by wit, compassion, and intellect rather than politics. She welcomed philosophers, poets, and musicians who traveled across France to seek her counsel. To them, she was no longer the scandalous queen or the dangerous sister, but La Reine Margot, the wise lady of Usson. She turned her prison into a salon. Candlelight replaced chandeliers, and the discussions that once echoed through the Louvre now took place beside a humble hearth. Poets read their verses to her. Soldiers told stories of loyalty and loss. Monks debated the soul's freedom. Her exile had stripped her of status, but it had given her something greater: authenticity. Still, nights were long in the tower. The wind howled through the cracks, carrying echoes of the wars below. Marguerite often walked alone along the ramparts, wrapped in furs, her eyes lifted toward the horizon where she imagined Paris, the city that had taken everything and to which she still belonged. She was no longer the radiant princess of Saint-Germain, nor the betrayed bride of Henry of Navarre. She was something new, a woman tempered by suffering, sharpened by solitude, unbroken by time. When illness swept through her small household in the early 1590s, Marguerite personally tended to her attendants, mixing herbal medicines, reading prayers aloud, and comforting the dying. "A queen is not made by her throne," she wrote, "but by her mercy." It was in those moments that she began to rediscover her own faith, not in politics, not in the church, but in endurance itself. She turned to her quill again. Her memoirs, written in elegant, deliberate prose, were not confessions of guilt, but chronicles of truth. In them, she named no enemies, only lessons. She reflected on the vanity of power, the fragility of men, and the quiet strength of women who survived them. It was, historians would later say, the first female voice of modern France. A queen who had been silenced and yet had the last word. By the dawn of the new century, Marguerite was in her 50s. Her hair had turned silver, her beauty softened by wisdom. Usson, once her cage, had become her monastery and her fortress of thought. When travelers passed through the region, they often spoke of a strange sight. A noblewoman walking slowly along the castle walls, a book in one hand and a rosary in the other, her gaze neither toward heaven nor earth, but somewhere between. She was not praying for release anymore. She was simply learning how to be free inside the walls meant to contain her, outside the lonely walls of Usson. The kingdom that had once defined her was reborn, but without her. By the end of the 1580s, the Valois dynasty had withered into memory. Her brother Henri III, the last of their line, had been assassinated in a monastery by a fanatic monk. His death extinguished a century of royal blood and left France without a king. For the first time in generations, the throne of France belonged to someone outside the House of Valois. That someone was Henry of Navarre, Marguerite's estranged husband. When news reached Usson that the man she had once married, the man she had hidden during the massacre of St. Bartholomew, was now Henry IV of France. She reportedly fell silent for an entire day. Her attendants said she neither spoke nor wept. She simply stared through the narrow window of her tower, as if watching the horizon swallow the past. Henry IV had achieved what the Valois could not: unity. But his path to the throne was paved with the bones of those who had doubted him. To gain legitimacy, he converted, again, to Catholicism, uttering the now famous phrase, "Paris is worth a mass." It was a decision of strategy, not faith, and it granted him the crown that had once seemed impossible. For Marguerite, it was a triumph and a betrayal in equal measure. Once, their marriage had been the symbol of reconciliation between Catholic and Protestant, sealed in blood and broken by massacre. Now, he stood as the King of France, the very peace her body and her youth had been sacrificed to create. And yet, she was nowhere in it. Her name was not spoken at court. Her portrait did not hang in the galleries of the Louvre. She was a ghost in her own story, erased for the sake of a dynasty that needed to forget. Henry IV had not forgotten her entirely. He understood that his marriage to Marguerite, unconsummated, scandalous, and politically useless, was a danger to his new reign. A king could not rule while bound to the memory of the Valois, especially one imprisoned in the mountains. He needed an heir, and Marguerite could no longer give him one. Through messengers, he offered her what was, in truth, an exchange of chains, her freedom in return for an annulment. At first, Marguerite refused. "They have taken my youth," she reportedly said. "Must they also take my name?" But time softened defiance. She was 50, living in quiet exile, while Henry's France burned for stability. At last, in 1599, she agreed. The marriage that had once drenched Paris in blood was dissolved, not with swords, but with signatures. Still, Marguerite extracted one final victory. She demanded to keep her title as queen, her rank, and her dignity. And Henry, perhaps out of guilt or lingering respect, granted it. In letters, he even called her "my sister," a title that hid both affection and remorse. With her annulment came freedom, freedom from the past, from duty, from the web of politics that had strangled her since birth. Yet when the gates of Usen opened after 18 years, she did not rush to Paris. She stayed a while longer, as if afraid of the noise of the world. The silence that had once been her punishment had become her peace. But beyond the mountains, the world had indeed moved on. The wars of religion had ended in compromise. The Valois were spoken of with pity, the Bourbons with hope. The French court now belonged to a new queen, Marie de Medici, a woman whose foreign elegance charmed the nobles and whose marriage to Henry IV gave France the heirs it longed for. When Marguerite finally returned to Paris in 1605, it was like a ghost stepping back into sunlight. The city she had left behind had transformed. The children of those who once feared her now bowed before her carriage. People whispered her name with a mixture of awe and disbelief. To many, she was the living relic of another age. The last Valois, the last witness of the massacre, the last princess of Renaissance France. But Marguerite no longer sought power or vengeance. Instead, she used her re-emergence to become something no one expected, a force of reconciliation. She befriended the new queen, Marie de Medici, and even showed affection toward Henry's illegitimate children, helping to educate and guide them. Her generosity astonished Paris. Those who remembered the fiery princess of her youth saw a woman transformed, not broken, but tempered. In her salons on the left bank, poets and philosophers gathered once more. drawn by the wisdom of the woman who had outlived every war and every rumor. She spoke not of kings and politics, but of forgiveness. "There are two kinds of victories," she said to a young scholar. "One won by swords and one by silence. The latter endures longer." At night, she would sometimes walk beside the Seine, wrapped in dark velvet, watching the reflection of Notre Dame tremble in the water. The same river that had once run red on her wedding night now flowed peacefully under the moon. The city had forgotten the screams. She had not. Yet in that forgetting, she found a kind of mercy. History moved forward. But she, the discarded queen, had learned how to live within its silence. Marguerite de Valois had been daughter, sister, wife, prisoner, and now, something rarer, survivor. The world that had destroyed her youth was rebuilding itself. But the scars she carried, invisible, unhealed, became her crown. And from the shadows of a forgotten dynasty, she watched the France of Henry IV rise, not as its queen, but as its witness. When Marguerite de Valois finally descended from the mountains of Auvergne and re-entered Paris in 1605, the city was both familiar and foreign. The air smelled the same, of river mist and roasting chestnuts. But the people, the buildings, even the rhythm of the streets had changed. She had been gone for nearly 2 decades. 18 years of silence had erased her from public memory, and now she returned as a rumor made flesh. A ghost from a vanished dynasty. The crowd that gathered to see her carriage pass through the city gates did not know what to expect. Was she still beautiful? Was she bitter? Was she mad? What they saw instead was a woman of serene dignity. Her hair, once black as ink, was now streaked with silver. Her gowns were simple but elegant, her jewels modest, her expression calm. The proud sparkle that had once defied kings had softened into something more powerful. Composure. She came not as a queen reclaiming her throne, but as a woman reclaiming her name. The new court of France was unrecognizable. The Valois had faded into legend, replaced by the Bourbon, by Henry IV, the husband who had once abandoned her, now ruling with a foreign queen at his side. Marie de Medici, young, fertile, and politically shrewd, had already given him heirs. The people adored her. The court adored her. And when Marguerite entered that same world again, there was no room for rivalry, only astonishment that she still lived. Yet Henry, perhaps haunted by his own past, welcomed her with unexpected grace. He called her our dear sister and arranged a public reconciliation that stunned Paris. It was not the reunion of lovers, but of 2 survivors who understood what the crown had cost them both. Before witnesses, Marguerite blessed him and his children, the offspring of another woman, and swore her loyalty to the new dynasty. It was the final act of her long transformation. The woman once condemned as a scandal now became a symbol of forgiveness. Her wealth had been reduced during her captivity, but what she retained, she used generously. Her home on the left bank soon became a refuge for the displaced. Widows, orphans, impoverished scholars, and poets. The same woman who had once been accused of vanity now distributed bread with her own hands. Chroniclers wrote that she spent her mornings in prayer, her afternoons hosting musicians and writers, and her evenings visiting the sick. Paris began to love her again, not as the queen who had failed to rule, but as La Bonne Reine Margot, the good queen. The title, once mocking, now became affectionate. Her name no longer stirred scandal, but nostalgia. The woman who had been called dangerous was now called wise. Still, Marguerite's past followed her like a shadow. In her quiet moments, she often revisited the places where her life had broken. the square where the royal wedding had taken place, the narrow alleys where the massacre of St. Bartholomew had begun, the Louvre, whose corridors had once whispered her name in accusation. She walked those streets without entourage, veiled and contemplative, as if to measure the distance between who she had been and who she had become. Witnesses wrote that she often paused on the Pont Neuf at sunset, gazing at the water that divided and united the city. The Seine, which had once carried corpses after her wedding, now reflected the twilight with quiet dignity. "It remembers," she once said softly to a companion, "but it forgives too." Her relationship with Henry IV remained cordial but distant. They corresponded occasionally. His letters were political, hers philosophical. When he thanked her for her loyalty, she replied, "My loyalty is to France. The crown is only its costume." It was the kind of answer only Marguerite could give, poised, barbed, and full of truth. With Marie de Medici, she shared no resentment. She saw in the young queen a reflection of her former self, beautiful, intelligent, and trapped in a palace that devoured peace. She counseled her gently, warning her of the loneliness that power brings. The two women, bound by circumstance rather than affection, maintained an elegant civility that impressed the court. But Marguerite's truest company came not from queens or kings, but from poets and thinkers. She gathered around her a circle of artists, theologians, and philosophers. They discussed Plato and Machiavelli, debated the nature of virtue, and listened as Marguerite recited her verses, delicate, introspective, and tinged with melancholy. She wrote of forgiveness not as surrender, but as liberation. "Vengeance," she told her guests one evening, "is a second imprisonment. To forgive is to walk free from the ruins." Her home became a sanctuary of conversation and music, echoing faintly with the brilliance of the Valois court, but without its poison. Candlelight softened her aging face, and those who met her often said they could still glimpse the beauty that had once undone men and monarchs. But even in this peace, sorrow found her again. In 1610, Henry IV, the husband she had once saved and later forgiven, was assassinated by a fanatic in Paris. The news reached Marguerite as she was hosting a small gathering of poets. She fell silent, then whispered only, "So ends the blood of our marriage." There were no tears, only stillness. The kind that comes from understanding that grief and history are the same thing. After his death, she prayed daily for his soul and for the children he had left behind. To those who visited her, she spoke of him not as a king or a betrayer, but as a man who had been devoured by the same destiny that once consumed her. In the last years of her life, Marguerite lived like a saint without a church. Her palace became a hospice of kindness, her voice a gentle thread of wisdom among the noise of a changing world. Paris adored her for it. The same people who once cursed her name now lined the streets to glimpse her carriage and bow. The Valois were gone. Her bloodline was extinct. But through grace and endurance, Marguerite had achieved something greater than power: redemption. She had returned not as the queen history had rejected, but as the conscience it could not erase. And as the bells of Notre Dame rang once more across the river, their echo carried not the sound of celebration or mourning, but of memory. In her final decade, Marguerite de Valois became something that no one in her bloodline had ever been: a peacemaker. The same woman who had once stood at the center of France's most brutal civil wars now devoted her remaining years to mending what power had shattered. Her house on the left bank, overlooking the Seine, became a place of quiet pilgrimage, half salon, half sanctuary. There were no guards at her doors, only candles in the windows and the scent of ink and roses drifting into the Paris night. Poets came to read their verses, scholars came to debate philosophy, widows came seeking comfort. She received them all with the same calm grace, listening more than she spoke. Gone was the sharp wit that once sliced through the intrigues of court. In its place was a gentler wisdom, the understanding that nothing in life, not even pain, is wasted. Every morning, Marguerite rose early and prayed at a small oratory she had built beside her chambers. There, beneath a wooden crucifix, she lit a single candle for each soul she had lost. Her father, Henry II, her mother, Catherine de Medici, her brothers François, Charles, and Henri, and yes, her husband, Henry IV. We were all, she once said, slaves of our crowns. Paris adored her transformation. To the people, she was no longer the scandalous princess of legend, but the embodiment of grace after ruin. La bonne reine Margot, the good queen. Children followed her carriage through the streets, waving flowers and calling her name. She would smile and toss them coins wrapped in ribbons. "Keep them as charms," she would say, against despair. But her fame was not a performance. It was redemption lived quietly, day after day. She funded the education of orphans, supported convents, and patronized young artists who could not afford paint or parchment. She sent food to the hospitals of Paris and paid dowries for poor girls so they could marry honorably. When plague returned to the city in 1612, Marguerite opened her doors to the sick and dying. A queen, she told her servants, is measured not by her jewels, but by her mercy. Visitors often remarked that her salons had the atmosphere of confessionals. People left lighter than when they came. She never judged, never condemned. To a young poet who despaired over failure, she said gently, "The heart must break before it can hold wisdom." To a widow mourning her son, she whispered, "Grief is the proof that love was real." Her words carried the weight of a lifetime of loss. And because they were born from experience, they soothed where sermons could not. Yet even as peace filled her rooms, the past sometimes returned uninvited. On quiet nights, when the streets were still and the river glowed under the moon, Marguerite would sit by her window and write. Her handwriting was steady, her sentences deliberate, not the feverish passion of youth, but the reflection of a woman who had learned to live with memory. She wrote of love as both a wound and a teacher, of betrayal as the sculptor of character, of solitude as a mirror for the soul. One passage from her later writings reads, "The years have taken everything I once thought precious, beauty, power, kinship. But in their place, they have given me what I did not seek, the peace of understanding. We are born crying not because we are weak, but because we know, from the first breath, that life will cost us dearly." That voice, tender, lucid, and haunting, made her one of the first great female memoirists in European history. Long after her death, her writings would inspire later generations to see that wisdom is often carved from sorrow. She found solace, too, in art. Music echoed through her house once again, not as the dance of youth, but as prayer. She surrounded herself with lute players and poets, with song and laughter that never turned to gossip. In those rooms, where politics had once devoured souls, she built something like a small republic of spirit, a place where beauty itself was resistance. Her relationship with Marie de Medici deepened in those years. The two queens, once bound by jealousy and distance, grew into mutual respect. Marie often visited her, bringing her young children, the future Louis XIII among them. Marguerite would hold the boy's hand and look at him long, as if trying to read the future. "Rule gently," she once murmured to him, "for the crown is heavy enough without cruelty." There was, in those visits, a strange poetry. The woman whose own reign had been erased, now shaping the conscience of the next king. By then, her body had begun to fail. The long years of confinement and stress had left her frail. Yet she bore pain with quiet dignity, refusing indulgence or complaint. To those who worried for her, she would say, "I have already lived many lives. The rest is gratitude." Her last public appearance was at a charity mass in 1614. Carried in a litter draped with white silk, she smiled faintly as the crowd knelt. Witnesses said she seemed almost translucent in the candlelight, more spirit than flesh. That evening, as she was carried home, she told her attendants, "Paris no longer belongs to me, but I belong to it, as memory belongs to love." In the months that followed, she rarely left her room. She spent her days reading scripture, revising her writings, and dictating small notes of reconciliation to those she had wronged, or who had wronged her. It was said that she forgave everyone, including herself. And in that final act of grace, Marguerite de Valois achieved what no king, no general, no priest of her age had ever managed. She made peace, not between armies or religions, but within the fractured heart of a nation and within her own soul. The princess who had once watched her wedding turn to slaughter now watched the dawn through her window with quiet eyes. The kingdom that had forgotten her name would, in time, remember her gentleness. The wars had ended, the ghosts had quieted, and the woman who had been hated, hunted, and imprisoned had become at last the conscience of France. On March 27, 1615, Marguerite de Valois took her final breath in Paris. Quietly, without ceremony, as if she were slipping out of history the same way she had lived in her last years. Gently, no throne awaited her in heaven, only the peace she had spent a lifetime seeking. She was buried at the Basilica of Saint-Denis among kings and queens who had long forgotten her name. Yet the city mourned her as if France itself had lost a memory of kindness. Bells tolled through the streets. Poets wept. Orphans prayed for the woman who had once fed them with her own hands. Marguerite left no heirs, no crown, no monument, only her words. In them, she preserved the truth that survival is not defiance, but grace. The blood of her family had built and destroyed a kingdom, but her compassion rebuilt something far greater, the soul of forgiveness. And so ended the line of Valois, not with violence, but with silence, and a woman who, having lived through every storm, taught France how to be gentle again.